Thank you for staying through this very long day. I'm Elizabeth Hemmerdinger. I'm the producer of this movie. This was sort of my idea, my crazy idea. But I want to thank the three of you and everybody else involved, but the three of you in particular for carrying a very heavy load. And we'd love to hear what you think of it. We'd like a little feedback. If you'd like to give us any questions or any feelings. Speechless? Well, we've invoked another good name. Our next journey is to find the right home for it. It hasn't, as Anne said, it hasn't been seen by anybody but our tightest, closest advisors. And so now we begin the journey. Now the journey begins for us to see where it can find its audience.
I mean, I think we think that there are a number of different audiences. When the final tweaks get done, we hope to be able to go through a festival circuit with the film, then in a broadcast length to make sure that it has a U.S. broadcast, and then for a number of years, I was director of distribution, foreign distribution for a public television station in New York. And we've had various people outside of the United States look at parts of this, and we hope to be able to bring the film to a broader audience, because no one really knows what it is that happens in American elections in full. And so we've gotten a lot of response like, I never knew that it was so complicated to vote. I never knew that you had to go through so many steps. I never knew that the state law is different in every single state. So we're going to hope to use the film as an educational tool to bring that information out.
Carol, since you remember last year, the votes you feel have been lost, do you have a new number?
No, that's the same number.
You mean in general, or just?
But I mean, has there more, more people discovered in the last few years? Those that have been left.
Well, what happened was we came last year and we were here 1 week after the election. So we knew what happened in our polling places, but this is not just a North Carolina problem. This is a national problem. And so in different places, there were all sorts of different numbers.
Oh yeah, it's very, you can extrapolate and say that if it happened here in North Carolina, in Cumberland County, this way, in districts that were controlled by local politicians like the guy with the string and his uncle or his, closer relative, more distant relatives, that we could go across the country. But the point is, Ron said it so well, politics has to be about adding. So crying over the loss doesn't do us any good, but going forward, if everybody can get to vote, if every vote actually counts, then we think the film will have made a difference.
When you look at the number from the precinct where Laverne was, and you see that 1,200 people came to vote that day, and only 598 actually voted. That's one precinct in one county in North Carolina. There are 100 counties in North Carolina. So if you multiply that just in the state of North Carolina, and you think about it nationwide, you realize what an impact this suppression of voting is having on the outcome of the elections. Though that 600 people who didn't get to vote had no voice. And if they had voted, North Carolina might have gone the other way. And so, as we've been working on this we've done this work for the last 3 presidential elections. And as the film mentions, In between the election in 2012 and 2016, the Supreme Court basically gutted the Voting Rights Act. And immediately after that, all the states that you saw started putting in new restrictions that they hadn't been allowed to do before. And, for all of us, it's become kind of the core issue of American democracy right now. This is at the base of everything. I think Reverend Barber says it when he talks about if the votes didn't matter, these people wouldn't be working so hard to stop you from getting in there to vote. And so for us, this has become kind of the focal point of everything that we've talked about today, about what's going wrong in American democracy. It starts here. When you start suppressing voices, and as Laverne says in the film, people stop believing in democracy. A vote is a statement of faith in the system. And as more and more of this starts to happen, the risks to democracy are great. And so we want to get that word out with the film.
Yeah, and one of the things that I really learned in working on the film was how sort of insidious and hard to see a lot of modern voter suppression is. It's not the images that we're used to seeing from the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, where you had, people literally barring African Americans from being able to vote. What happens now is it's much harder to put your finger on. It's much more about misdirection and neglect. And I think what's so interesting to watch an audience see that number, that 1,200, 598 number, is it's really shocking. But by the time you get there in the film, it's not entirely unexpected, because you have a chance to see how people are shunted from one place to another, how registrations are lost, how people are purposely given the wrong information. You start to put a picture together of how this can happen. And I think it's a very difficult thing to fight because it's hard to see. And so hopefully we can shine a little bit of a light on how to look at it differently.
Living in the system. Anyway, and then to the end of the film, talking about, what you've got in your hand is a vote. And I think thinking about politics, thinking about policymakers, they've got in their hands the American people. So how do we sort of get people to realize that what they're holding in their hand is the blind faith of the people who can barely get to the polls to vote for them? And so how do we, besides helping people, understand what their voting rights are and how to properly protect themselves when they get to the ballot, how do we convince the policymakers and the men upstairs to realize what they've got in their hands?
That's a really good question. Yeah. I wish that some of the other panelists earlier in the day were here to sort of help with that from the insider perspective, but I think that's a really good point.
And it's a question we're asking ourselves all the time. I'll say for myself, I think Laverne agrees with me, I think everyone here agrees with me, that one of the goals of doing this film was to start getting the word out to more and more people about what is happening. And one of the great lessons, and it's something I'm glad you've seen the film and can think about this, but one of the things that we've learned over the last 3 presidential elections is, in the past, we would volunteer every 4 years and go down to Virginia or North Carolina to do the kind of work you just saw. And then we would go home and go back to our lives. And we realized in this last election in November, when we saw some of the things we saw, that is not really that effective. It's like the system's broken, and what we do every 4 years is go and try to put a Band-Aid on it and help a few people get in there to vote. And we came away, as you can see in the film, feeling like it's not good enough to just jump in every 4 years, volunteer for a national campaign, and go to some state and try to fix little problems. It's a slog. It's a lot of hard work, daily work. You can't stop and wait every 4 years, because what you want to do is try to fix the system in the years between the big elections, so that the next time we go down, there aren't as many problems to solve. And so what we're hoping is this film will show people a model. We're just average citizens. We have our lives, we're going around doing, we're not politicians. This is not something we ever did before. But we felt we wanted to make it, we wanted to help, and it was a short week volunteering. We want to show people a model of how every individual has a way that they can do something, that it is something we have to be vigilant about all the time, not just every election. And we have to find a place where we can apply our energy and our passions to fix this problem.
So your fix may be making sure that helping people to get registered, or your fix may be showing up at hearings when discussion about gerrymandering is up, or to make sure that if there are ballot initiatives in your state that help with giving more access to voting. I mean, we came from New York to a state where they have early voting. We don't have early voting in New York. So there are things that come up through your state legislature, through the places where you are, that together give a way for people to have more access to the ballot. And what your commitment is to make sure that you know what that is and then hold your elected officials accountable.
Given everything that's going on right now, I mean, we also have a 500 number. How much more are you expecting that number to be next elections, 2020?
That's a really good question because, and it's it's an unclear question because in North Carolina, there have been several different lawsuits brought, and one of the issues has been gerrymandering, and that is not settled yet. So until that gets settled and we know where the districts are and how that's happened, until we get the whatever the law is, you saw us there poring over that law. It was 63 pages of election law.
Just to vote, and we're lawyers, and we couldn't figure it all out.
I mean, you know, and so whether or not you can get an absentee ballot and what day and whether somebody can get it for you and who has to go or what happens if you're at the wrong polling place, all of that is in that law. And being able to have a system, a state by state system where the law is easier and registration is easier is something that needs to be worked on now, not at election time.
And we know, if you have experience here in Europe, these issues are not here. People I know, all my European friends, they go to vote and they go home. And when friends of mine who live outside the U.S. see this, they seem really shocked that there are so many problems and that, they never realized the American democracy was putting up so many barriers to getting people inside just to cast that ballot. And, it can be fixed, but there has to be the will, and the citizens have to be vigilant.
I really love what Paul says at the end of the film when he talks about like the tasks of democracy are not abstract, they're real tasks. And I think one of the things that's so difficult is that I think the electorate in general feels very separate from its governing body. I think that the distance, I mean, we heard a lot today about the distance between people in Washington and the voting population, but that goes both ways. Like, we have to, as voting people, reach up as much as we need them to reach down, or reach whichever way you want to reach, whether it's up or down. But I think that that's something that, that we're really, I think is really important to remember, that we have a responsibility as citizens to hold people accountable.
I live in Italy for 4 months a year, so I vote from here. I voted for Hillary from here when that went on. I just am about to vote for a city council, and I live in a small town, but I vote by email. They allow me to vote by email because the mails they know aren't very good in Italy, they say. But I wonder why we can't help other people get their ballots by mail and then maybe drop them off or vote by mail in other places in America.
Well,
Do they do it in a lot of places
no,
now?
that we have to work hard to change what the rules are. For the elderly,
They're actually changing in the other direction right now. A lot of the laws that have been introduced, when you saw that map turn all red, a lot of those laws restrict how absentee ballots can be collected and cast by third parties. Like there's a lot happening that restricts that as opposed to opens it up right now. There is a huge push to restrict voting in America. It's really enormous, and we've heard little bits about it covered in the press, but the scope of it is really astonishing when you start to look at what that means. And each one of those laws means you have more people who are discouraged from voting and fewer votes cast, period.
And it happens state by state, so it's different everywhere, and it's like a multifaceted battle, and it's like an octopus, and it's hard to fight it in a unified way.
There's a question there. There's also a malaise. There isn't a large turnout. We heard Doug say that. If everybody showed up who's supposed to vote, things would be different. This young lady.
So do you think that voter suppression, there was mention of race and racism. Do you think that voter suppression is racially charged? And if so, how do you think they're able to get away with that?
Well,
Laverne?
it's my question. What is so hard in a film like this, as Ann said, is that you expect something really blatant, but it's not blatant. And in North Carolina, I can give you a very specific example that you wouldn't think of as a racist thing. But what they used to have in early voting is more early voting days. And they had more early voting days on the weekend. So people who really have to work had more access on the weekend. And they had more early voting days on Sunday. And what used to happen in North Carolina in black churches is that people would go to church, then they would organize cars for people to go from church directly to early voting.
It's called Souls to the Polls.
Yeah. So what happened this year when they restricted early voting? Oh, so many of the early voting restricted days were on Sunday. And what did that do? In North Carolina, 60% of the votes in early voting. So if you start taking away days in early voting for a group that expect that, and especially on the days that African American voters vote, that is a specific and racially charged way to change who gets the vote.
And actually, there was a lot of research done on voting patterns before they started making new restrictions, and there was a core challenge to a lot of these restrictions, and the judge who overturned a lot of them in the decision said that the laws were made with surgical precision to target minority voters. Like, they really researched voting patterns of minorities, and then they changed the rules for early voting, like Laverne just said, and other things, just to target the patterns of the minorities in the state. And then they got those dates pulled out, and they reduced the number of minority people who were able to vote. You see it through the whole country. In some states, they have voter ID now, and the states will decide what ID will qualify. So you have states that say a student ID is not sufficient documentation as an ID document, but your gun ownership ID card will be. So look what they're doing there. They're excluding students, and they're making sure that gun owners are going to vote. So they do, it's like subtle, and if you're not watching carefully and reading every line in the law, you miss how they're in a very targeted way, trying to create an electorate that will help them.
Well, in North Carolina has a very particular state legislature. their state legislature is one of the most radically right state legislatures in the country. They routinely pass laws that they know are unconstitutional and wait for them to work through the courts. They tried to disempower the incoming Democratic lawyer because their Republican incumbent was defeated this last time. The legislature went into a special series of meetings to try to take away all of his legislative power. Executive power, sorry, his executive power. And so, in that case, you're looking very specifically at laws that are being crafted by a specific legislature at a specific point in time. But the thing that's important to remember about all of this is that it's sort of easy right now to look at what's going on and say that it's, you have these radical right legislatures doing this. Historically, whoever is in power uses that power to control the elections. The Democrats did horrible gerrymandering, at certain points in time. So it's really about why do we have a system that allows the party in power to control so much of the electoral process for its own personal gain? And that's really the question that after working on the film for a year, it's sort of come down to me as like, why do we have this system that allows who's ever in power to stack the cards in their favor? And I think it's an important question,
But today, as Ann said, it can be both parties that do this. Right now, it's tending to be much more Republican-controlled states. And in North Carolina, through gerrymandering, the Republicans have been able to get what's called a supermajority in the legislature, so that they can override a veto by the Democratic governor if he doesn't want to sign a law of theirs. They can then override that and put it into law anyway. Basically, they have the freedom to make any law they want, and nobody can stop them. And so they do, as Ann said, we've seen over the last few years, they come up with these ways to stop people from voting, and then they wait while it goes through the courts. And then when it's overturned, they go back and come back with, it's amazing to watch. They will not give up. They announce some new restrictions, and then they wait for those to work through the courts. In the meantime, they're basically sabotaging the whole process. They're making people lose faith in the power of the vote and the system. And as I think one of Jen Fry from Democracy North Carolina says in the film, by making it confusing so that even a week before Election Day, you don't know what the law is because there's a court decision about to come out that may change everything that was on the books a week before. It makes it harder for people who are watching to know what it is they're looking for, to understand what the rules are on the day of the election because they changed the night before. We talk in there about how thousands of voters were purged from the polls just the week before the election, and then Friday, before Election Day on Tuesday, a judge ordered all those names put back on the polls. How do you do that? The chaos that ensued, and you saw all these people who showed up who thought they had registered and their names didn't appear. So they're given provisional ballots, which, as you saw, are mostly not even counted after the voting is finished. So they've rigged it in so many ways that they're achieving their goal.
Areas, in all the minority areas in Florida, they put billboards up, and they had the wrong date. The date was after the voting was over.
Oh,
so
nice.
that all those people were given the incorrect date so they wouldn't vote.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's a very sad state of affairs. Yeah.
Somebody had a question?
Hi.
Hi.
I just had a general question. It was mentioned in the movie, but just kind of the discouragement of voters. I'm from Florida, and for example, we're one of the only states that felons are barred from voting, and that right is just stripped from them. And I have a lot of family members that I'm oh, are we going out to vote? And they're no, why would I bother? My representatives don't care about me, and the government doesn't even want me to vote or my friends to vote. On that same wavelength, how do you deal with, or what do you say to someone who really, the faith is just completely lost? It's why bother? I've been turned away. People of my community don't have the right to vote. What do you, I know there's no right answer, but with people that, deal with that on a bigger basis.
I'm going to answer it like this because Ellen's asked us to wrap up, because it's late and you've all been so wonderfully kind. First of all, start to email us. We have a website, and we'll spread the word. It will begin tiny and grow to be something much bigger, we hope. We hope our the people who've shared this conference with us will be moved to make changes, and we have to say that the politicians can't choose the voters, but the voters have to choose the politicians, and that every vote counts. And so if that becomes a motto, so like we're trying to think of the right title for this film. Is it Capture the Flag? Is it Every Vote Counts? I'm not asking for an answer, but that we need the rallying cry as we move forward. Ellen will figure out a way to post how to find us to do the rallying.
Yeah, okay. Join me in thanking the panel for this beautiful talk and wonderful time.